Mr Speaker, I'm delighted to contribute to this stage of the Appropriation 2012-13 Estimates Bill. When the Minister, Bill English, introduced this debate, he said that this bill carries on in the same theme as the budget. And I noticed that Minister Parata paled at those words, thinking of those days of agony that she had to go through when, first of all, she had to admit to the entire House that no, she hadn't asked for any information at all in relation to what impact the budget cuts in the education sector would have on the number of children who are going to be in classrooms around our country. She seemed surprised that we would expect her, as the Minister of Education, to have asked for that information. Then she had to tragically come down to the House and correct her answer, having denied receiving such information, because in fact her office had received the information. So not only did she not bother asking for it, she didn't even know that her office had received it. Heaven only knows what her Cabinet colleagues thought when they signed off the education budget cuts. Did they not think, what will the implication be in our classrooms for our children and their quality of education? But of course, the Prime Minister rode to the rescue of the poor by then stunned, silent minister, and said, no, we're going to put a cap on these changes, on these cuts to education in this year's budget. So they announced this great fix, and then just a week later they said the deal's off, we're going to have to find the money somewhere else. So when Bill English said this is going along the same lines as the budget, I must admit my heart went out to Minister Parata. I thought, that's really cruel. I hope she doesn't have to go through that same week and a half of embarrassment again for the Minister of Education to not know that when you cut the education budget, when you change the ratio in the classrooms, that it will have an impact on the number of children in each classroom, in every school, and undoubtedly that has an impact on the quality of education. Now, I don't think the Minister has quite grasped the point yet. She laughs at parents, she laughs at teachers, she laughs at the anger that people felt when they were told that their child could have another 5 or so children in their classroom and it wouldn't make any difference. That is not what teachers, parents, even children feel about what we all want, and that is quality outcomes. So Bill English said this is going to be along the same lines as the budget. Well, Mr Speaker, that just means there's nothing in it that has any leadership, any aspiration, any vision for New Zealand. It was an absolutely zero budget and missed out on all the opportunities that New Zealanders would love to see coming from the government, all the opportunities that New Zealand would thrive on, that New Zealanders are crying out to see. Instead, we got a budget where the centre point was really taking money out of the pockets of paper boys. That was like the high point. That was the inspiration from Bill English that we got to see in the budget. Let's turn the poor little paper boys upside down, rattle their ankles and see if we can get a few coins out of their pockets. A pitiful amount of money, but taxing paper boys was a key element. We saw the other piece of legislation that came in, of course, under urgency in the budget, was capping the amount of money that people could keep to themselves to leave for their families in those final days of their lives when they were living in a rest home. So having had an annual increase of $10,000 in the asset threshold, the government said, no, that's too much. We don't want elderly people to keep that sort of money. We want them to pay it to us, to the government, for their rest home care. So they put a stop on that as well. So we saw the most vulnerable people in our communities, older people who live in rest homes or in hospitals, and the youngest in our community who are doing a few hours' work a week doing paper runs, getting taxed on that money. Mr Speaker, I think if anyone from any other country in the world heard those two policies as centre points to the budget, they'd be hanging out for the next page of the budget document. But it wasn't there. There was nothing at all providing any vision, providing any leadership. And that's what New Zealand wants at the moment. That's what New Zealand needs so that we can go back playing our part as a strong contributor on the international economy. National have put their head in the sand over the most important issues facing New Zealand, over superannuation, over economic growth, over any vision and foresight for where New Zealand is going to go in the future. And in my view, it's not just a lazy thing, it's shirking the legitimate responsibility of government. There are hard decisions for a government to make. There are decisions that should be made that will challenge their popularity even. And in my view, and it was certainly the view expressed by the Honourable Simon Power in his valedictory speech to this House, in my view, that's part of the privilege of the responsibility of government, facing up to those hard decisions and making them for the betterment of the whole nation, not for the popularity polls, but for what's best for New Zealand. So, Mr. Speaker, we know in any budget that there are choices, there are alternatives, there are different ways that different political parties look at things. I did have to have a little chuckle, though, at the member who resumed her seat immediately prior to me, where she started boasting about targets that had been set by the National Party, targets that were set, and she said, we set these targets so that we meet them. Well, I'd be quite keen to know what happened to the 4% growth that John Key predicted. In the budget, the measures of which we're debating, the growth rate is set at 2.6%. That's quite a gap between a target that was set and a target that was met. Last year, John Key, the Prime Minister, said we would have 170,000 new jobs created. This budget that we've just finished debating cut that target by 16,000. Those aren't just figures, those are real people who can't get paid employment even though they desperately want to, because the target that John Key as the Prime Minister set was not met, another target not met by the government. Last week he said that exports were rising. Well, Mr. Speaker, the latest statistics show that exports fell in the last 12 months by 17%. That's $800 million worth of exports. So the trend in exports is going down rather than going up. That's another target that wasn't met. Last year, the Prime Minister said we would get a real growth in wages this year. Mr. Speaker, we've seen it peak at just 1.5%, and now it's trending down again. That is not a set of targets that have been set and then are met. That's a set of targets that John Key, the Prime Minister, promised New Zealand, and then he and his government failed to meet those targets. Mr. Speaker, there are alternatives, as there always are. There are alternatives for this government to step up to the mark and face up to and to deliver, or for the voters of New Zealand to elect another government that can provide a different way of leading our nation. We do need leadership that is willing to make the tough decisions, that's not prepared to say, we'll put our heads in the sand, we'll bury the hard issues, and we hope they will go away. We need to ensure that we do support businesses to create new jobs and support higher incomes for New Zealand. Reaching the surplus seems to be the only target that this government has. They're even prepared to sell New Zealand-owned assets in order to achieve that surplus. Well, of course, reaching a surplus is important, but a single-minded approach of reaching surplus is not good enough. The sacrifices that the national government is making New Zealanders and our economy pay in order to reach that surplus is just unfair. It's not about spending more money, which is always the National Party's chant. That is not the position that Labour has always espoused. It's about making the right choices. It's about looking at the options for the budget and saying, what is our priority? What is the best way to invest in New Zealand now, so that as we move out of difficult financial times, New Zealand and New Zealanders are on a stronger footing to take advantage of that better economic times. We've seen alternatives tried in other countries. Mr. Speaker, the budget in this appropriation bill is a wasted opportunity from the national government. It's a continuation of a zero budget with no ideas.
I call Jonathan Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, better financial times.